Welcome to the Zachrilege podcast YouTube video interview program that features me talking to some of the best and brightest in the atheist / secular / awesome community. This is episode number 214. I recorded this interview on March 2nd, 2020. Thanks to the ladies at Left of the Valley for being my previous guests. It's a great show. Yeah, you'll hear about news, so that's potentially depressing, but it's good to hang out with great friends while talking about the potential end of the world, isn't it? It turns out there are atheists near me. They're everywhere. There are actual human beings living somewhat close to my house who share one thing in common with me. That's often all you need to start a friendship. John C. Snider started American Freethought in 2007, which seems decades ago. That's like 700 years in podcast years. I recall with fondness when the word freethought was always a good thing. He's been interviewing authors and people in the community for 296 episodes, and yeah, I might catch him on episode totals by 2025. We talked about his Baptist start, going to church for real, and when it's okay to criticize atheist leaders. Let's start the conversation. This is the sound of me opening a Black Barrel Imperial Stout. Welcome to the Zachrilege cast. John Snider, American Freethought Podcast. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I probably should do that with my my podcast, sing my own intro.
Hey, singing is good. Well, it depends. But I did want to introduce, so the official beverage of the evening is the Monday Night Tears of My Enemies.
Nice.
Not drinking with an enemy, drinking with a friend. This is the bourbon barrel version. They have multiple versions. I want to have a local beer. Like sometimes, I'm interviewing somebody in a different state, and I'm like, oh, do I have something from there? And it's like, well, I definitely have something from Atlanta. So we're both Atlantans, although, Atlantans can live up to an hour and a half away from each other.
Right.
So sometimes we struggle to actually, meet in person, but here we are in the virtual world. So thank you for agreeing to be on.
Oh, thank you.
So how did you get the podcast started? Because you're up to, I believe your next episode is 296. So you're really getting up there in the numbers.
Yeah, it started in 2007. So I had been doing online publishing for, I guess in 2007, I've been doing online publishing for about 7 years. I used to do an online science fiction magazine, now long since defunct, called Sci-Fi Dimensions. But I thought I would branch out because free thought and separation of church and state and that sort of thing were things that I was very, very intensely interested in. So I started a blog, American Freethought, in the fall of 2007. And then shortly after that, I started with my friend David Driscoll, the American Freethought Podcast. And we did that from 2007 until 2017, I think. Almost 10 years we went, and then went on hiatus. And then in January of 2019, I started it back up on my own. Didn't have any kind of a falling out with David. He just is very, very busy with his job. So I just decided to try to do it solo.
Yeah, it's funny how a lot of podcasts that do stop, it's not necessarily like, all right, I'm done. Although some people, that's true. It's just, okay, I have a life, or because you do find a way to kind of shoehorn this into your life. And then if you take that time out, you're going, wait a second, what am I doing with this time?
Yeah.
Great things, of course. So what is what would you consider kind of the American Freethought kind of elevator pitch?
The elevator pitch. Well, it's an atheist podcast. I don't make any excuses for that. And the focus of the podcast is mostly issues of separation of church and state, how religion affects public policy and legislation. It may occasionally delve into the history of free thought, and as well as current events, that sort of thing. And we also look from time to time into how religion abuses people, especially how the organized religions can abuse people. So that's primarily our focus. We don't really, I say we, I have rarely had somebody on to just argue with, like, the Atheist Experience out of Austin, Texas. They like to have callers call in, Christians that they can argue with. And I've never really done that on this podcast.
Well, I guess I'd say there could be an echo chamber, but I'm sure there are plenty of atheists you can find that you will disagree with.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
It does happen. So what's your own religious background?
Well, I grew up, I'm 56 at the moment. I grew up in rural Kentucky, literally on a tobacco farm. And we went to the Southern Baptist Church. And this was just before the Southern Baptist Church was taken over by the super right-wing faction that has had control of it now for the last 40 years. It was still quite conservative, don't get me wrong, but it was not as obsessed with certain things as it is now. But I didn't have any childhood trauma going to church. I didn't feel like I didn't want to go. I mean, I won't kid you about that. It was boring, and I would much rather stay home and watch Star Trek or something. But we went to church regularly, Sunday morning, Sunday night. In fact, I played the piano in our church for most of my high school years, I guess it was. It was a very, very tiny church. We're talking 50, 60, 70 people typically for a Sunday morning service. And so we went pretty regularly. And I, quote unquote, joined the church when I was 8 years old, had the so-called conversion experience, and was pretty much a dyed-in-the-wool, genuine, serious Christian until maybe 18. So that's my childhood background anyway.
Well, in the Baptist church you grew up in, was it one of those situations where you were baptized or you were kind of in the church, but then you had to make the decision to be in it? And you said age 8.
Yeah, no.
Is that typical for the church you're in?
Yes, I think it's typical for Southern Baptists. For Southern Baptists, is the usual progression is at the end of every service they have what they call the invitational, and they'll sing a song, and if people feel moved by the Spirit to come up and say something to the congregation, they can. And if you want to come up to the front and say that you've accepted Jesus Christ into your heart and declare your devotion to God, that's your opportunity. And so when I was 8 years old, that's what I did. You go up to the front of the church, scared as hell, and make the confession, and then sometime very soon after that, they would have an actual baptism ceremony. So the Baptists are definitely full immersion dunkers. When I was a very young child, they had baptisms in a pond. I mean, it was serious old school going out, onto some farm and watching people be baptized. But by the time I came along, they actually had a baptismal, which was just a big kind of hot tub looking thing behind the preacher. And that's where we did it.
Yeah, I think if there could be an atheist version of that in a hot tub involving some kind of beverage, I think maybe we
yes. Yeah,
that could work. Some kind of pasta strainer,
yeah.
Spaghetti monster situation.
Yep.
But when did you feel like you ever were really that far in, or was it more of a, hey, this is what my family does, I'll go along, right. And then after a certain time, you thought, wait, this might not be for me.
Well, when I was 8 years old, of course, it was at a revival meeting, and they usually bring in a guest preacher for revivals, and this was a real fire and brimstone guy. It was a guy that I'd seen preach before, but I just felt that the time was right. I didn't want to go to hell, so I went up to the front and did the thing, and I was pretty serious Christian. I prayed and felt bad if I committed what was thought of as a sin or did something wrong. I definitely tried to be a serious, devout Christian.
But at what point in your life, did you have a eureka moment where you were like, oh, wait, this isn't me?
Right. Well, okay. So when I was 14, I received as a Christmas gift a Bible, and it's called, you may have heard of the Schofield Reference Bible, but it's basically a Bible that has historical critical commentary and footnotes and a lot of supplemental material down at the bottom that talks about difficulties with translation and that kind of thing. And I was a very bookish child and still pretty bookish, like to read. And so I got this Bible and I thought, okay, I can read, not just read the Bible, but read all this commentary. And right out of the gate, you start reading things about how, like, Genesis is traditionally assigned to Moses as author. And the first, 4 or 5 books of the Bible are supposed to be written by Moses. But right out of the gate, the commentary says that scholars generally agree that Moses did not write the first books of the Bible. And in fact, he couldn't have written all of them because he dies about 2/3 of the way through one of them. I can't remember if it's Exodus. I think it's Exodus. But he dies in the story, and it says that, he was buried and blah, 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 and life goes on. So right out of the gate, I thought, well, what they're saying from the pulpit isn't 100% true. And then as you start, when I started reading through the Bible, you would get to a point where it would say, there would be a word and there'd be a footnote, and it would say, the meaning of this word is not clear, or there's dispute as to the meaning of this word. And I'm thinking, how could this be the complete inerrant word of God? And they're saying that they can't agree what this word means. So progress on through the Bible, then you get into the 4 Gospels, for example, and I'm reading along, and there's a footnote, and it says, these verses do not appear in the earliest known manuscripts. And those verses were the verses that talk about Jesus rising from the dead and appearing to his...
was that the end of Mark where...
I can't remember.
The initial... And, there will not be a quiz at the end.
Right.
Like the initial version of Mark, the first gospel, actually the women just run away. And then later, Jesus comes back. Somebody put that in.
Yeah.
But it's kind of impressive because, I thought was unique about your story is the fact that you were converted away from Christianity by a Christian because the author of the book was a Christian.
Yeah, Cyrus Schofield was of course, he's been dead for more than 100 years, but he was a quite devout fundamentalist Christian who created this Bible as a study guide. And he included a lot of the critical commentary just because that was what was being discussed at that time. When a lot of the footnotes and supplemental materials were devout, Christian propaganda, for lack of a better word, but there was enough stuff in there that I just thought, this doesn't make sense. It didn't shake me from being a Christian, but what it did say to me was that the Bible is not inerrant. Because if you look at the 4 Gospels, it's like Jesus was there at the grave when these women showed up, or he wasn't at the grave. And then there were 1 angel appeared to the women, and then 2 angels appeared in another book. So, people say, oh, that's just the variation of eyewitness testimony, but this is important stuff. I mean, a God rises from the dead and you can't get your facts straight. So that was what planted a little bit of a seed in me that maybe the Bible was not the end all and be all that it had been presented as.
But was there an age where you officially left, and did you actually have to officially leave the church? Did that cause any
I did not have to officially. For all I know, I'm still on the rolls at the Bethlehem Baptist Church in Spencer County, Kentucky. But no, I didn't do anything. What happened by the time I was 18? I would 18 or 19 and went to college. I would say I was what you might call just a generic Christian, kind of a non-denominational. I just thought, maybe the Bible has problems and errors and inconsistencies, but there's a truth there. And as long as you believe in Jesus, you'll be saved and go to heaven. And then a little more time passed, and I go to college, and I meet people from all different religious backgrounds, and people who had grown up within, 50 miles of me, who had literally never been to church, which blew my mind. And they didn't know anything about the Bible, but they seemed to be just as nice and moral a person as anybody else that I had ever met. So by the time I was out of college, I would say that I was sort of vaguely religious, but not really. And then when I got off on my own, I graduated college and moved here to Georgia, and was on my own. And I did attend church sporadically for a year or two after I got down here. And then at one point I just thought, I don't think I believe any of this stuff. And I just quit going. And so maybe age 25, I would have conceded that I was an atheist.
So you've been around in the atheist circles for a while.
Well, it happens if you live long enough.
Well, on your show, the episodes I've listened to generally have you kind of doing a bit of a talk at the beginning, and then you get to an interview. Is that the normal format for the show? And what's the normal kind of episode length? And is it a weekly show, bi-weekly?
I put it out every other Sunday, so it's a bi-weekly show. And it's funny, but when I started the show, it was with David Driscoll. So he and I were the co-hosts. We shared sort of research duties, and we would sort of alternate taking the lead on conversation and that sort of thing. And that worked really, really well because we had personalities that kind of synced up, so we could kind of feed off of each other, and it felt very natural. And what we were trying to do is to create an environment where you felt like you had just sat down at the neighborhood pub with us, and we were just BSing about whatever was in the news. That was sort of the original conception. And then, of course, we would bring in people for interviews. And then when I started doing it on my own, I discovered that I'll just concede, my weakness as a podcaster is I don't speak just into the ether by myself very well. I don't know how guys that do radio broadcasting, for example, can just keep a rap going and it's very natural and it just sounds like they're talking to you. I find that very difficult. So I do have some episodes where it's just me talking about things that are in the news or relaying some information. But what I like to do is to interview people as much as I can, because number one, they're the experts and they can teach me something, but it also helps me because I'm actually speaking to another human being. And so the conversation seems more natural. And so that's kind of the format of it. And as far as the topics go, as I mentioned, I'm a book lover, so I like to read. And so I very frequently interview people who have written a book about religion or the history of free thought or current events or something like that. So, recent interviews have been with, there's a lady named Ann Nelson who wrote a book called Shadow Network that talks about the organizations that are trying to basically turn America into a Christian nationalist country. But I've also interviewed other people. I'm trying to see here. I've got some books here, like Jeff Charlotte, who wrote The Family.
Oh yeah, that's also on Netflix now. But
yes,
he's done a few books.
Yeah. There's a Netflix special based on his two books. He wrote one called The Family and another one called C Street. And we had Jeff Charlotte on 2 or 3 times. We've also had Bart Ehrman, he's a theologian who writes books about the early Christian era for a popular audience. So his books are very easy to read, easy to digest, but he looks at sort of what was Roman culture like at that time and how it affected the Israel. and he talks about how like Greek mythology and Greek culture affected the ancient Jews, et cetera, et cetera. So he's got a new book coming out called Heaven and Hell, and I'm going to be interviewing him if everything works out for a very near future podcast.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. The thing about Bart Ehrman he's a guy that writes about like biblical history, and he's an atheist, and he's really popular, and he shows up on a lot of Christian shows. That would be you could talk to him on like one of 500 topics and do 4 hours and just be great. It's something else, because he was definitely the person that you go, wait a second, this history of the Bible, it's like, oh, this is the most recorded copied book ever, and then you're like, well, actually, if you look back at it,
he definitely explodes a lot of myths.
And I really wonder, a lot of things people take for granted, and this is what a lot of atheists who have been religious go through, is a lot of the stuff they just take for granted is like, is that actually in the book? If you really look. Well, we should really call it books, because the Bible is kind of like the Old Testament, and then fan fiction, and then a few other fan fictions like Mormonism and stuff.
It's a book of books.
And I'm looking forward to, in the chat room, we have somebody called Evolution False. Occasionally, very rarely do I have an actual, looks like Christian, maybe a troll in there. So if ever a genie in there, I'll have a good time talking with him. So do you have special plans? Because like episode 300 is coming up pretty soon.
We have very rarely done, of course, we've had 100th episode. Actually, I went back and looked. Bart Ehrman was our guest on our 200th episode. So I might have the Bart Ehrman interview be the 300th episode. So I hadn't really thought about doing any kind of, I don't know what I would do for the 300th episode. It's kind of tedious to go back and try to listen to all the previous episodes and find something that's really cool, and juicy. That would take forever. We're talking 300 hours of content, to go through. So I can barely remember sometimes some of the people that we've interviewed. I'll have to think about it a minute to remember if we actually spoke to this person or that person.
Would you have any kind of dream guest lists or people you wanted to have on your show?
Well, I would love to have had any of the four horsemen. Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Daniel Dennett. Have never been able to get, of course, Christopher Hitchens has passed away, unfortunately, but I came close to getting him on back when he was alive, because I met him at an event here in Atlanta and mentioned to him that I had a podcast and we'd love to have him on. And he said something like, well, I'm in the phone book. And I thought he was just kidding, but then later I looked up, and sure enough, you could look him up in the actual phone book, but I just never actually called him. But I've invited Sam Harris, I've invited Richard Dawkins, I've invited Daniel Dennett, and they all are just very busy people, and they either just don't respond or, will make a polite excuse, and that's the end. I would love to have spoken to I would like to have spoken to Ayaan Hirsi Ali. That might actually happen at some point, but I'm trying to think who else. I also would have loved to speak to, do you know Bishop John Shelby Spong?
No.
He's very, I don't know how old he is. He's quite old, but he's written a lot of books that are, I wouldn't say they're like Bart Ehrman's books, but he basically will say that he doesn't believe that Jesus physically rose from the dead. He doesn't think that Jesus performed miracles and was born of a virgin and, all that stuff. But he insists that there was something about Jesus, some essence of him that was so impressive that it spawned this religion. And he's written several books that are really interesting reading, but he's a sincere Christian, but he's more, I would say, in the kind of Unitarian vein. But I've read one or two of his books and really enjoyed them and traded a couple of emails with him. But as soon as he found out I was an atheist, I think he kind of put me put me at arm's length.
Yeah, sometimes, I don't know, I don't want necessarily my show to be about like arguing with somebody, because I don't think debates have to be really like, the people have to be really good, and they have to be able to kind of interact. If it's two people talking their points and then not responding to each other, and that happens a lot. Like Bart Ehrman does a lot of debates. Yeah. And it's just like, okay, we're not getting anywhere. It's like, where can we connect? And I think sometimes with the like liberal Christians, I mean, was this 214 episodes of this show, and I've had maybe 3-4 religious believers on the entire time. So there are plenty of atheists around, so it's understandable. I think, it's like, find people who want to talk, and if they do, then, great. So how long, you said you moved to Atlanta, how long ago?
Well, I moved to Georgia in 1985, straight out of college, and worked for the Air Force down at Robins Air Force Base, which is down in the middle of the state, and worked there for 4 years. But I moved to Metro Atlanta in 1989. So more than 30 years now.
It's impressive, because I feel like I'm almost a native. I've been here since 96. I'm like, oh, look at you, get ahead of me.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of people who are from Atlanta who still live here, but the joke is like, everybody comes to Atlanta at some point, because it is the biggest city in the South, as far as I know.
Yeah, it's a big melting pot. I mean, there's no doubt.
Doubled since I've been there. So someone who has kind of a Baptist background, was it especially interesting for you to have a guest on, like your last guest, Ann Nelson, who wrote a book about how kind of the religious right and politics became, kind of enmeshed together over the past 40, 50 years?
Well, yeah, it was very interesting to speak to her. And I also spoke to a woman named Catherine Stewart, who I think this next episode that's coming out this Sunday will be with her. But she wrote a book called The Power Worshippers that covers, to some extent, the same territory as Ann Nelson's Shadow Network. So I do find it interesting, just because I did grow up in a conservative Protestant environment, and these are my people, so to speak. These are the people that when I go home, or if I'm on Facebook interacting with some of my old high school classmates who basically never moved away from the area, and they're all just dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore Protestant Christians, and which I guess there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but they also are, Republican voters, and say and post things that I find, frankly, appalling. So it's interesting for me to see that. And then when I read these books that talk about the powers behind these political and social movements, you can kind of see how people are being manipulated by propaganda. Basically, these business interests are forming coalitions with evangelical groups to sort of groom voters to think and vote in certain ways, and to be myopically focused on a small number of issues that also get connected to other issues like economic issues or tax-related issues and that kind of thing. So yeah, I joke on the podcast that I like to read things that are very interesting, but also infuriating and kind of disheartening, because you look at the networks that have been created, for these conservative religious groups, and there's really no corollary on the left. And that's something that I think, the Democrats should be paying attention to.
Well, I guess the question on that would be, okay, so the Republicans have created this kind of almost one or two issue situation where people are like, okay, I'm voting for the person who says they're anti-abortion.
Yeah.
No matter what the deal is. Can the Democrats do that, or can they learn from this kind of, I mean, I know one thing that the Democrats can learn from the Republicans is think, kind of local as well as national, because I think the focus now is like, just get the president and everything will be great. We've had that a few times in the past 40 years, but are there things like Democrats you think can learn from the Republicans, and will some of their tactics actually work?
Yeah, well, that remains to be seen. The problem is that, well, number one, I guess there's a couple of things. First, the Republicans are actually, and to some extent, the victims of this social movement. We've seen over the decades there have been Republicans who have tried to be moderate, who have tried to say, well, I do believe in a woman's right to choose, and then that got whittled down because they would get primaried, or people would, they would lose their support if they made any kind of moderating comments about abortion or about, gay rights or something like that. And so it's gotten to the point where these groups, these nonprofit organizations and megachurches and libertarian billionaires have created this environment where the Republican candidates and Republican leadership just got gradually winnowed out, so that the Mitt Romneys of the world, he's a pariah now. I mean, if you remember, 8 years ago, people were scared shitless over the idea that Mitt Romney might become president because, he's a Mormon and he's conservative, and oh my God. And who wouldn't give a kidney now to have Mitt Romney be president, compared to what we have now? So I don't know if the progressive movement in America can duplicate some of the tactics. I do think that, for example, when you hear Joe Biden, part of his pitch is that he's the guy that can reach across the aisle and work with the Republicans, because that's what he's done for the last 50 years. But I think he is blinded to the reality of present day Republicans, the Mitch McConnell crowd, that their main tactic is no negotiations, no compromise. And that's how they have succeeded. So if the Democrats ever get control again of the House of Representatives and the Senate and the presidency, they need to just do what they need to do and not try to compromise with Republicans on it at all, if they can help it, because the Republicans are not going to compromise. And I think they have burned too many bridges in that regard to be trusted in the future. So I know that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I don't know if the Democrats can really do what the Republicans have been doing, or the conservatives, in terms of creating these sort of shadowy coalitions. And I'm not sure that I would want them to. I would rather that the Democrats succeed simply by being, the party of honesty and the party of, compassion and progress. I mean, that's what a progressive is somebody that wants the country to have progress. So I also think that the demographic tide favors the Democrats in the long run. So I have some hope that before I die, that, the demographic wave will have made current Republican style politics sort of a permanent minority style of politics.
Well, to get from politics, where all the Democrats are mad at each other right now, well, why don't we talk about the kind of the atheist community? So when you were, we'll get there in a second. Let's work our way to it.
Okay.
So what was it like being interviewed by members of a local Baptist church? Because you talked about this 2 episodes ago. So episode 295 for people checking along. We'll have a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah. Well, so the background on that is there's a man here in Metro Atlanta named Paul Wallace, who is he's a physicist who teaches at a local university, but he's also an ordained minister and a assistant pastor at a church called First Baptist Church of Decatur. And he wrote a book that was trying to reconcile his faith with scientific outlook. And I didn't agree with most of what he said in his book, but he said it very well and was quite eloquent in his writing and seemed like an honest fellow. And I actually saw him give a talk. And so I asked him if he would be interested in coming on my podcast. And so he came on and we had a very interesting conversation. Like I say, I don't think either one of us convinced the other one to change his mind, but he is the assistant pastor for adult education at FBC Decatur. So he has been doing this thing where he invites someone of a different religious tradition to come and be interviewed in front of the class, the members of the congregation that come. So he did one evening where he was interviewing atheists. So it was myself and another guy named Chuck Porterfield, who were the sacrificial atheists for the evening. And so we just sat up on a stage and he asked us questions to explain a lot of the similar questions to what you're asking me now. And they had a little Q&A at the end. But keep in mind that the First Baptist Church of Decatur belongs to something called the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which is it's a breakaway from the Southern Baptist Convention, and they broke away originally over the issue of ordination of women. So the CBF doesn't police their congregations as closely as some of the other Baptist denominations do. So they are very open and accepting of LGBT people. They have ordained ministers there that are gay and women. So, and this is the same church, the CBF is the same denomination, if for lack of a better term, that Jimmy Carter belongs to. So Jimmy Carter is a very, very liberal Democrat, by today's standards. So going to speak to people at First Baptist Church of Decatur was not exactly going into the lion's den. They profess to be believers, but they also would agree with me on virtually every political issue that we would vote on, gay rights and women's rights and things of that nature. So they made us feel completely welcome. Nobody told me I was going to hell. Nobody passive aggressively said they were going to pray for me. Nobody interrupted me. I mean, not once did anybody stop the conversation to tell me that I was wrong. And my wife, in fact, came to see the thing, and she said afterwards that if all Christians acted like that, that atheists would never have any objections to them. So it was actually a very pleasant experience.
Well, in your episode, you talked about questions. I don't remember if it was like they were all asked of you or there are questions that they asked that didn't come up. But one of them was about like your favorite atheists and your least favorite atheists.
Yeah.
So who came up first on the least favorite atheist list?
Well, yeah, he didn't actually. What happened was Paul sent us some questions ahead of time just to kind of give us an idea of the flow of the conversation. And some of those questions we didn't actually get to in the event at the church in Decatur. But I talked about the questions on my podcast because I just thought they were interesting to talk about. And as far as least favorite atheist, I mean, you could go easy and say I'm not a big fan of Joseph Stalin or Chairman Mao because they quite literally murdered millions of people, and they were atheists. But they didn't do those things in the cause of atheism, so to speak. Joseph Stalin was going to kill anybody that he perceived as a threat to him, and so a lot of people in the Russian Orthodox Church were victims of his cleansing policies, whatever you want to call it, and the same with Chairman Mao. I mean, so. But as far as actual people who profess to be atheists, doing things in the name of atheism, I would be hard pressed to say that I literally have a least favorite atheist. I mean, Richard Dawkins has said stupid things that I didn't agree with, and Sam Harris has said some things that I, don't find particularly useful. But I respect their opinions as atheists, and I don't have a lot of objection to the things that they've written about. So, I don't know. And I did talk about David Silverman, who was the former president of American Atheist, who got fired from that job for alleged sexual misconduct. And although I have great respect for David as an activist and thought he did a fantastic job when he was the president of American Atheist, I thought he went a little off the rails and still is kind of going off the rails in trying to explain himself and to paint the people that have made accusations against him in an extremely negative light. And he could be right about them. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there for the things that were alleged to have happened. I wasn't present when the board of directors of American Atheists discussed his case and decided to fire him. So I freely admit I don't have all the facts at hand, but I will say that I don't think that there is a secret feminist cabal that's out to make sure that every white man in the atheist movement gets removed from his job and, have a loss of reputation, which is what he alleges.
Yeah, there's a lot that's happened. I mean, do you think of that like when you have a guest on and later like, oh, this person really made a turn? Or are you just like, hey, I had this person on, we talked, stuff happens?
Yeah. I'm trying to think. There hasn't been, I mean, we've had so many people on that, yes, occasionally somebody that we've had on the podcast will say something dumb. And, I've had David Silverman has been on American Freethought 4 times, maybe. I've kind of lost count. But when he was president of American Atheist, he came on, a few times and was very accommodating to us. And so I was obviously appalled when I read these accusations against him, and further appalled at some of his handling of it. And I invited him to come on the podcast back in the fall because he did find another job as the executive director of the secular, the Atheist Alliance International. So he did find another job after about a year, I think, from his losing his job with American Atheists. So I did want to talk to him about his job, his new job, and then I really just wanted to touch on the controversies about these sexual accusations. But if you go back and listen to the interview, it pretty much 2/3 of the interview just went right off the rails, and he was, complaining about these people and how they're all out to get him. And, I don't know that it's true, but it just seems a little crazy. And then, of course, no sooner than I had recorded the interview with him, he gets fired from from the Atheist Alliance International over yet another accusation of sexual misconduct. And all that stuff happened. I mean, it was happening so fast that from the time I recorded the interview to getting it edited and recording some of the introductory material, the whole situation had just changed incredibly fast. So that was just a big shit show, more or less.
Sometimes it goes that way, sometimes off the rails is a good thing. And sometimes, there's a reason why they call it that. So do you get involved at all in like local atheist groups in Atlanta? Because for me, leaving the house is a bit of an issue, but maybe you have better luck than me.
Well, I have been involved in the local atheist community since the early mid-90s, I would say. In fact, the way I found out about the local atheist community was this is back 1995 or 96. You could look it up to figure out what day it really was. But I was reading in the newspaper back when you actually had newspapers that there was a guy going to be coming to Atlanta to speak about his experience as a juror for this Alabama circuit judge named Roy Moore.
Oh,
and so at the time, Roy Moore was just some 2-bit judge that had the 10 Commandments on a plaque behind his desk, and he would have a preacher come in and give a prayer before the jury went off to deliberate. And so this juror who was not a religious man, objected to this. And, that was the first big controversy that Roy Moore got involved with. And so I had read about this case, and I heard that this juror was coming to speak at something called the Atlanta Freethought Society. And so I thought, I'll go check this out. So when I go to the meeting and walk in the door, the first person I laid eyes on was one of my coworkers. And we worked at a very large electronics company. And it was like being in a secret society, because I had worked with him for a year or two at that point and just had no idea that we shared very similar views about religion and politics and so forth. So anyway, I've been on the board of directors of the Atlanta Freethought Society for a while. I'm not in any leadership positions right now, but I am a lifetime member of the Atlanta Freethought Society, and I've been a member and participant with a lot of other groups. The Atlanta Skeptics is another local group that used to be a lot more active than they are now. But my wife and I will occasionally go to the Atlanta Freethought Society meetings when they have a speaker that we find interesting. So yeah.
Well, I apologize in advance because I didn't prepare you for this. So we're at the end, like to have something a little light before we finish. So do you have like a special talent, or perhaps you have a joke to share with the audience now? Because I mentioned it. Well, maybe something that people who don't listen to the podcast, maybe they don't know about,
Yeah,
you still play the piano, that sort of thing.
I don't. I am very not musically talented. I mean, I did learn by having it beat into my head, but I don't really have any great talents hidden or evident. But I would say I'm pretty darn good with trivia. So if you teamed me up with somebody that knows a lot about sports, we could probably win. So, I've been told more than once that I have a head packed with useless knowledge. So maybe that's my secret power.
Well, maybe we could, like Wonder Twins unite or something, because I did a lot of sports. Although people say sports, and I'm like, well, it's mostly football. So there's a baseball question probably done, but that's the way it goes. You get as specific as you need to. So where can people find American Freethought?
Well, you can go to AmericanFreethought.com, and that will take you straight to the podcast website. And I'm on Twitter at AmerFreethought, and we have a Facebook page. Just go to Facebook and search for American Freethought. And if you want to send me an email, it's john@AmericanFreethought.com. And when I think of anything else, I think that's about it.
Well, links will be in the show notes. Well, John C. Snider, thank you for being on the show tonight. It was great.
Okay, great. I appreciate it. I had fun.
This is the sound of me opening a dragon's milk. Live read. If you're feeling helpless and alone, you're not alone. That's right. You too can prevent forest fires, and you can submit Freedom of Information requests. It's fun and easy. Check out Worst Year Ever for how to destroy the government. Hey, that's their description, not mine. If you want to support the show, be like Freethinker215, Alan Marks, Human, Chris the Post, Modern, Polymath, Podcast, Larry Darrell, and the other Darrell. And go to support the show at patreon.com/Zachrilege. Follow me on Twitter, like the Zachrilege Cast page on Facebook. Send all mail to zachrilege.cast@gmail.com. Gotta work on getting those guests, but I will be on a recent or upcoming episode of American Freethought Podcast and the Postmodern Polymath Podcast in approximately 15 minutes after recording this. So, until then, let's continue the conversation.